This video is part 3 of a series that I'm doing on how Jesus cast vision when he called his first disciples and what we can do to imitate Jesus when it's time for us to cast vision to those God has placed under our care. Let's get started. Welcome to Equipped. I'm Mario Escobedo. On this channel, I do a lot of Bible study videos and other types of videos as well. But no matter what I do, it's all with the intention of providing you with tips and tools to share the Bible more effectively with those God has placed under your care. If that sounds interesting and or helpful, then consider subscribing to this channel and tap the notification bell so that you're always up to date on the latest teachings. Now, in this series, I'm talking about casting vision. And what I'm suggesting is that one of our primary roles as pastors and church leaders is to cast vision to our people. Not only that, but your weekly sermon is one of the most powerful and most effective tools that you have at your disposal for casting vision. And by vision, I mean presenting a scenario, painting a picture of something better than what currently is. That could be for individuals or for your church as a whole. But without a doubt, as pastors and church leaders, a primary responsibility that we have is that of casting vision. And so in this series, what I'm doing is I'm looking at the episode in the Gospel of Matthew when Jesus called his first disciples, and the phrase, he just used one phrase, as far as we know, one phrase to call them to be his disciples. And what I'm saying is that with that one phrase, he cast vision to them so effectively that immediately they left their nets and they followed him. So let's take a look at this passage again, and then we're going to break down the third principle in this series. So here's how it reads, talking about Jesus in Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 through 20. It says like this: While walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. Now, where I'm focusing the primary attention in this series is on the only phrase that Jesus said to them, as far as we know, at least the only phrase that Matthew recorded: "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." But Jesus did this so effectively that verse 20 shows the response of the disciples. Immediately they left their nets and followed him. So what do I want to tell you? What principle am I going to share with you when it comes to casting vision? What principle do I see Jesus exemplifying in this pericope? Here it is. It's very simple. I'm sure you already know it, but it bears repeating, right? Here's what it is. Jesus knew how much they could handle at that moment. I'm going to have to go to another passage in Matthew to explain what I mean by this, but the language that Jesus used with his disciples when he called them was so key. This was so strategic on Jesus's part because he knew in that moment that he was talking to fishermen. And so he knew that he had to cast his vision using language and terminology that was adequate to where the disciples were in that moment and what they could handle in that moment. Now, let me show you what I mean by that and how, with time, Jesus's language with his disciples changed, even though I think he was saying the same thing. Now, for this, I'm bringing up two passages. Here we are, side by side, two passages. Matthew 4:19, which we just read, and then Matthew 28:19, which is part of the Great Commission that Jesus left with his disciples right at the moment that he's ascending to heaven. Now, here's what I'm suggesting to you. I'm going to read both of these, and I'm going to pose something to you. Matthew 4:19 says, "And he said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men.' Matthew 28:19 says, 'Go therefore and make disciples of all nations.'" Now, here's what I'm proposing to you. Jesus, in these two verses, with these two phrases, is actually saying the exact same thing to his disciples. It's the same thing that he's saying to them. The difference is that he says it differently. And the reason he says it differently is because he was aware of what the disciples could handle at the moment that he iterated both of these statements. He knew where they were, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. He knew what they could handle. He was aware of their level of discipleship maturity. He was aware of their level of spiritual maturity and what it is they could handle. Again, I think that Jesus is essentially saying the same thing in both of these verses, but notice Matthew 4:19 comes at the beginning when he calls the disciples, and Matthew 28:19 comes at the end when he's commissioning the disciples. But still, he's saying the same thing. And here's the point I'm making. Imagine if in Matthew 4:19, Jesus had used the language of Matthew 28:19, when he's barely calling these fishermen. They don't have much training, any training really, to be disciples or spiritual leaders. They've been fishermen probably all their life. They don't feel that they have whatever is needed to be disciples of a rabbi. Imagine if at that moment when he's calling them for the very first time, they're there at the side of the lake with their nets, literally fishing, or just having come in from having been fishing. If in that moment when he called them, what would have happened if he would have used this language from Matthew 28:19 with them? Hey, follow me because I want you to make disciples of all the nations. I think that would have blown their mind to the point that they would have said, yeah, I think you got the wrong guy. Like, you probably want to go to the synagogue, or you want to go down to the temple in Jerusalem. Your guy is probably there, but we're just fishermen. So notice how Jesus, when he first calls his disciples, he uses language they can handle at that moment. They knew what it was to be fishers. So Jesus used where they were in that moment, and he called them. He said, hey, I see that you're fishermen. Follow me. I'll make you fishers of men. That was something they could handle at that moment. I don't think they were able to handle, hey, follow me so you can go make disciples of all nations. They couldn't handle that at that moment when Jesus was calling them. And Jesus knew that. And so what does he do? He was aware of where they were in that moment. And so he issued a call using language, terminology that they could understand where they were at that moment. Now, after 3 or 3.5 years that the disciples were with Jesus, they had learned a lot. They had grown a lot. They weren't the same people that they were when Jesus first called them. So Jesus tells them the same thing that he told them back when he first called them, but now he uses terminology that they could understand because they had matured and they had grown. All right. You know that whole fishers of men thing? Let me recast it to you. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. Same thing. It really is the same thing. But the difference is, at the beginning, the disciples were here. After spending time with Jesus and being discipled by Jesus, now that we're up here, they could handle a more robust call, a more robust commission, and terminology that was a lot heavier and carried a lot more weight to it. Jesus was masterful in doing this because he was aware of where they were in that moment and what they needed to hear and what they could handle. And Jesus did this throughout his ministry. You'll notice that whenever, quote unquote, sinners would come to him, he spoke to them very differently than he did with the religious teachers, the teachers of the law, the Pharisees. He was a lot harsher with them. He spoke in using words that they could understand that maybe the regular common people wouldn't be able to understand. So Jesus was masterful at doing this, and I see a clear example of him doing that here in the call, the initial call, and then in the commission, saying the same thing, but using different language based on how much the disciples had matured and grown. So if Jesus indeed, if he knew how much they could handle at that moment, and he used this kind of language because he knew what they could handle, what does that mean for us today? I think it's a very practical and a very easy correspondence for us today as pastors and church leaders. We need to be aware of what people can currently handle. As we're discipling people, as we're preaching in our weekly sermons, which are powerful vision casting tools, we need to be aware of where the people are and how much they can handle. And this is something of a juxtaposition. That's a great word, right? That in earlier videos, I said how we have to talk to people about what they can become and overlook what they currently are. Talk to them about what they become. And now here I'm telling you, hey, well, use language that they can currently handle. Yeah, and as pastors and church leaders, we have to balance that because we can paint a vision of what they can become, but we need to be careful of how we do that because we need to present it in a way that they can currently handle. So I'll throw out an example just off the top of my head. Maybe there's a husband that you're discipling and he's going through some really bad marital situations. Well, you can present a vision and say, hey, look, I see that you can have a great marriage. I see that you can strengthen your marriage. You can restore your marriage. You can have a happy marriage. That's forecasting, right? That's future casting. You're showing them what they can be. That's very different from saying something like, hey, you know what? I see God restoring your marriage and you're going to be preaching to hundreds of men. you're gonna pack out auditoriums and stadiums, and you're gonna start preaching in our church. Next year, you're gonna preach and you're gonna talk about how God brought you through this. Wait a minute. I just want to know how to do a date night with my wife, right? It'd be way too much for that man to handle in that moment. So as pastors and church leaders, yes, we cast vision for what people can become, but we have to be careful, do it in such a way that they can handle. And there are times this can be frustrating for pastors and church leaders. I'm living that right now, that you have this massive God-sized vision that you want to fulfill, but there are times that when you present that vision to your people, you may have to, pump the brakes a little bit. You may have to calibrate it for where they are at the moment, because what can happen is that if you present this huge vision that God has given it to you and you can do it, but if your people aren't there yet, they're going to see it as pie in the sky, dreaming, oh, this is unattainable, and they're not going to give their energy and their effort to helping you fulfill that vision. As pastors and church leaders, we exercise wisdom. And we calibrate the vision that God has given us so that our people can digest it. I mean, you've been thinking about the vision for months probably. They're hearing it for the first time. You have the benefit of having prayed and heard from God for months perhaps before you present it to your people. They're just hearing it for the first time. And you want to unload like with double barrels, right? Here, I'm giving you everything God has given me. You calibrate that and speak to them at a level that they can currently handle. And we need to be aware of that. This goes for when you're presenting vision to your church as a whole, but it also goes for when you're talking with a person one-on-one. You're discipling that person one-on-one. Use that gift of discernment. Ask the Holy Spirit for discernment so that you can calibrate and know where that person is, so that when you present, hey, here's what you can become, you can do it using language and asking them to do things that they can handle based on where they are right now. Speak to them in terms of, hey, here's one step. Here's your next step. Don't worry about steps 9 and 10. Let's just worry about step 1. And when we've done step 1, we'll move on to step 2, which is going to be a bit more rigorous than step 1, but I know you can do it. So you lead people that way, always aware of where they currently are. That's what I saw Jesus do in this call to his disciples. He didn't, at the outset, he didn't use the language of making disciples of all nations. Oh, what? I think that would have been way too much for the disciples at that initial call. He calibrated. And then when they had grown, matured, had been discipled by him, then he said, oh, guys, guess what? I need you to go and make disciples of all nations. Oh, they were ready for it at that point. So that's what we do as preachers and as church leaders as well. We calibrate and we talk to people with this awareness of what they can handle at that moment. And this applies to your sermons, your weekly sermons, or if you teach, or if you lead a group, a home group or something like that, you need to do that. And along those lines, I have a free resource that I'd like to share with you that will help you calibrate. It'll help you calibrate your message of vision as you present it with your people. This is completely free. You can find it at my website. There's a link in the description of this video. You can pick it up absolutely for free. And I know it's going to help you, because in this video, I talk about the 3 most strategic questions you must answer to prepare effective, engaging, and life-transforming sermons. And part of that is the casting of the vision, right? Both for your church and for individuals. So be sure to pick up that free resource, completely free to you. It's available to you right now, so it can help you as you cast vision to people and craft incredible sermons for your church every single week. Because remember, your weekly sermon is one of, if not the most powerful tool that you have at your disposal for casting vision. Hey, like this video, share, leave comments, all those things people ask you to do on YouTube. I'm asking you to do them for this video as well. I hope that you feel a bit more equipped when it comes to casting vision. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next one.